May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The day the world celebrated, the day Nazi Germany officially surrendered, the day church bells rang from London to New York, the day soldiers danced in the streets and strangers kissed and champagne flowed like water. The day everyone believed the nightmare was finally over. But in a quiet office in Bavaria, Supreme Commander Dwight David Eisenhower sat reading a letter that made his blood run cold. A letter that wasn't addressed to him. A letter written by General George Smith Patton to his wife Beatrice. A private letter that military censors had flagged and sent directly to Supreme Headquarters because the contents were so explosive, so dangerous, so potentially catastrophic that they couldn't be allowed to reach their destination. 9 pages. Handwritten in Patton's distinctive scrawl, and 9 pages that laid out old blood and guts vision for what should happen next. And if that letter had reached the wrong hands, if it had been intercepted by Soviet intelligence, if Stalin had read what George Smith Patton was planning, World War III would have started before World War II was even cold. This is what happened next. They called him Old Blood and Guts. General George Smith Patton. By May 1945, he was the most feared combat commander in Europe, the man who'd raced across France faster than anyone thought possible, who'd relieved Bastogne when everyone said it couldn't be done, who'd crossed the Rhine ahead of schedule, who'd driven deeper into Germany than any other Allied army, whose Third Army had killed or captured more enemy soldiers than any force in American military history. George Smith Patton was a warrior born centuries too late, a man who belonged in ancient Rome, leading legions. In medieval Europe, commanding knights. In the Napoleonic era, charging at the head of cavalry. Instead, he'd been born in 1885, California. Had grown up reading military history. Had memorized every major battle from Marathon to Gettysburg. Had graduated from West Point, believing his destiny was military glory. And World War II had proven him right. But on May 8th, 1945, sitting in his headquarters in Bavaria, surrounded by maps of conquered Germany, Old Blood and Guts wasn't celebrating. While soldiers danced and drank and thanked God they'd survived, George Smith Patton was staring east, toward the Soviet lines, toward the Red Army that had advanced from Stalingrad to Berlin, toward Stalin's forces that now occupied half of Europe. And Patton was thinking about what came next, because for Old Blood and Guts, the war wasn't over. The shooting had stopped. Germany had surrendered, but the real war, the war that would define the rest of the 20th century, was just beginning, and George Smith Patton could see it coming with crystal clarity that terrified him. The war against communism, the war against the Soviet Union, the war that would make World War II look like a preliminary bout. That night, alone in his quarters, Patton began writing a letter, not an official report, not a military memorandum, a personal letter to his wife, to Beatrice, the woman he'd been married to for 35 years, his confidant, his anchor, the one person in the world he could be completely honest with. Dear B, the letter began. Today they're celebrating victory, but I can't celebrate because I know what's coming. I know what we've done. I know the terrible mistake we've made, and I know that if someone doesn't act soon, everything we fought for will be lost. The letter continued, 9 pages, handwritten, pouring out everything George Smith Patton had been thinking for months, but couldn't say publicly. Everything he'd observed as Third Army drove across Germany. Everything he'd concluded about the post-war world. And it was dynamite. Pure political dynamite that could explode the entire Allied coalition. B, we fought the wrong enemy, Patton wrote on page 2. I've been saying this for months, and everyone thinks I'm crazy. Eisenhower thinks I'm politically naive. Marshall thinks I don't understand grand strategy. Churchill smiles and changes the subject. But I'm not crazy, and I'm not naive. I understand exactly what's happening. We just spent 4 years destroying Germany, the one nation in Europe that could have stopped Soviet expansion, the one military force that could have stood against Stalin, and we destroyed them. Systematically. Completely. We bombed their cities into rubble. We killed their soldiers by the millions. We've occupied their country, and we're dismantling their government, and we're putting their leaders on trial. And while we're doing this, Stalin is taking over Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, all of it, gone, handed to the communists. given to a dictator who's killed more of his own people than Hitler killed Jews. The letter got worse, much worse. I've been watching the Red Army, Patton continued, yet watching how they operate, how they treat occupied territories, how they behave towards civilians. They're barbarians. They rape and pillage and murder. They steal everything that isn't nailed down. They're occupying Eastern Europe like Genghis Khan occupied Asia, and we're letting them. We're actually cooperating with them, sharing intelligence, coordinating operations, treating them like allies instead of the threat they actually are. I've talked to German officers, captured generals who fought on the Eastern Front. They tell me stories about Soviet tactics, about Red Army behavior, about what Stalin's regime does to people it conquers. And everything they describe is worse than what the Nazis did. More systematic, more brutal, more thoroughly evil. George Smith Patton paused, read what he'd written, knew it was dangerous, knew he was putting thoughts on paper that could destroy him if they became public. But he kept writing, because Beatrice needed to know, because someone needed to understand what was really happening, because the truth mattered more than his career. Here's what should happen. Old Blood and Guts wrote on page 4. Here's what I would do if anyone in Washington had the courage to listen. We should stop right now. Should halt at our current positions. Should tell the Soviets that we're not withdrawing to the occupation zones agreed at Yalta, that we're staying in place, that we're not giving them Berlin or half of Germany or any of the territory we've conquered with American blood. And then we should make Stalin an ultimatum. Withdraw from Poland, withdraw from Czechoslovakia, withdraw from every country you've occupied, and return to your pre-war borders, or face the consequences. The consequences. That was the part that made this letter so dangerous. What consequences? George Smith Patton spelled them out in detail. If Stalin refuses, if he insists on keeping his conquered territories, then we rearm the Germans, immediately. We take the Wehrmacht units that are surrendering to us right now. We give them back their weapons, we put them under American command, we combine German military expertise with American industrial power, and we attack the Soviet Union. Now. While the Red Army is overextended, while Soviet supply lines stretch all the way back to Moscow, while Stalin thinks we're allies, we strike fast and hard, we drive the Soviets out of Eastern Europe, we push them back to Russia. Yeah, and we don't stop until we've destroyed the communist regime and liberated the Russian people from Stalin's dictatorship. Patton knew how insane this sounded, knew that suggesting America should ally with defeated Germany against the Soviet Union was political heresy, was a betrayal of the wartime alliance, was exactly the kind of thinking that got generals fired. But Old Blood and Guts didn't care. He was describing what he genuinely believed needed to happen. I know this sounds crazy, he wrote on page 5. I know people will call me a warmonger, will say I don't understand politics, will claim I just want to keep fighting because that's all I know how to do. But I'm not crazy. I'm seeing clearly what everyone else refuses to acknowledge. The Soviet Union is our enemy, was always our enemy. We allied with them out of necessity. You see, because Germany was the immediate threat. But now, Germany is defeated, and Stalin is the threat. The bigger threat. The more dangerous threat. The threat that will dominate the next 50 years if we don't stop him now. The letter continued with tactical details. George Smith Patton had been thinking about this operation for months, had been planning it the way he'd planned the relief of Bastogne, the way he'd planned the Rhine crossing, with meticulous attention to logistics and terrain and timing. We have 8 American armies in Europe right now, Patton wrote. About 3 million men, plus British and French forces. The Soviets have maybe 4 million in Germany and Eastern Europe, but they're exhausted. They've been fighting continuously since 1941. Their equipment is worn out. Their supply lines are impossibly long. And their morale is terrible. They've won, so they want to go home. They don't want another war. We hit them now, we hit them hard. We could break them in 3 months, drive them out of Poland in 4 weeks, out of Germany in 6 weeks, back to Soviet borders in 3 months. Then we stop. We don't invade Russia, we don't try to occupy Soviet territory. We just push them back and we establish a line, a defensive line that protects Europe from communist expansion. This was the vision that would have started World War III. This was George Smith Patton's plan for the post-war world. not occupation and denazification and Marshall Plans and United Nations. War. Immediate aggressive war against America's current ally. A surprise attack while Stalin still believed the alliance was intact. Using German soldiers who'd surrendered expecting to be treated as prisoners of war, turning them into allies overnight, rearming the Wehrmacht days after accepting their surrender. It was strategically brilliant, politically catastrophic, morally ambiguous at best, and absolutely impossible. The American people would never accept it. Congress would never authorize it. The British would never support it. The entire world would see it as betrayal, as warmongering, as America choosing to continue a war that had just ended, as old blood and guts proving he was nothing more than a bloodthirsty warrior who couldn't adjust to peace. But Patton didn't care what the world would think. He cared about what he saw as the truth. "I know they won't listen to me," he wrote on page 7. "I know Eisenhower will dismiss this. Marshall will ignore it. Truman probably doesn't even know who I am. I'm just a field commander, a tank driver, old blood and guts who's good at killing Germans but doesn't understand grand strategy. But B, I need you to understand. I need someone to know that I saw this coming, that I warned them, that I knew Stalin was the real enemy, and I knew we needed to act before he consolidated power. So, when World War III starts, and it will start, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10, maybe in 20, but it will start, someone will remember that George Smith Patton tried to stop it, tried to prevent decades of Cold War, tried to save Europe from communist dictatorship, and they wouldn't listen. The letter concluded with personal notes, Patton writing about wanting to come home, about missing Beatrice, about hoping this would be his last war, about dreaming of retirement, of raising horses, of finally having peace. But even these personal passages were tinged with bitterness. "I don't know what's going to happen to me now," Old Blood and Guts wrote. "The war is over. Germany is defeated. I'm not needed anymore. Political generals like Ike will run the occupation. They'll rebuild Europe. They'll implement whatever naive policies Washington dreams up. And warriors like me will be put on a shelf, discarded. We're too dangerous for peacetime, too aggressive, too unwilling to pretend that enemies are friends and friends are enemies. So, I'll probably be sent home, given some ceremonial position. Maybe they'll let me train troops, or maybe they'll just force me to retire. Either way, my war's over. I just hope I'm wrong about what comes next. I hope Stalin proves to be more reasonable than I think. I hope the Soviets withdraw peacefully. I hope we can have real peace instead of the uneasy alliance that everyone's pretending is victory. But, Bay, I don't think I'm wrong, and that terrifies me." George Smith Patton signed the letter, sealed it in an envelope, addressed it to Mrs. Beatrice Patton in Massachusetts, and handed it to his aide to be sent through military postal service. That letter should have reached Beatrice Patton within a week, should have remained private correspondence between husband and wife, should have been filed away in family archives, maybe discovered by historians decades later as an interesting window into Patton's thinking. Instead, it reached Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force within 48 hours. Because military censors were reading everything, every letter, every communication, every piece of mail sent by high-ranking officers was screened for security violations, for classified information that might compromise operations, for anything that could damage Allied unity or post-war planning. And when a young lieutenant in the Postal Censorship Office opened Patton's letter to his wife and began reading, he realized immediately that this wasn't just security sensitive. This was a diplomatic nuclear weapon. The lieutenant brought the letter to his commanding officer, who brought it to his general, who brought it directly to Eisenhower's chief of staff, who brought it to Supreme Commander Dwight David Eisenhower himself. Ike read the letter twice, the first time in disbelief, the second time in growing horror. George Smith Patton was advocating immediate war with the Soviet Union, was suggesting rearming the Germans, was planning a military campaign against America's ally, was putting all of this in writing, in a personal letter that could be intercepted, could be read by Soviet intelligence, could be used by Stalin as evidence that America was planning to betray the alliance. This letter was proof that a senior American general was advocating surprise attack on the USSR. If Stalin got his hands on this, the consequences would be unthinkable. The Soviets would mobilize immediately, would prepare for American attack. would launch preemptive operations. The fragile peace would shatter. The alliance would collapse. World War III would start not because of careful planning, but because of George Smith Patton's inability to keep his mouth shut. Eisenhower made a decision immediately. The letter would not be delivered, would never reach Beatrice Patton, would be confiscated and destroyed. And George Smith Patton would be called to Supreme Headquarters for the most serious conversation of his career, May 10, 1945, 2 days after VE Day. General George Smith Patton arrived at Supreme Headquarters in Reims, France. He'd been summoned by Eisenhower. No explanation, just orders to report immediately. Old Blood and Guts assumed it was about occupation duties, about post-war assignments, about the boring administrative work that would replace combat operations. He walked into Eisenhower's office expecting a routine meeting. He found Supreme Commander sitting behind his desk with a letter in his hands. Patton's letter. The letter to Beatrice. "George, do you know what this is?" Eisenhower's voice was cold. Dangerously cold. "That's a private letter to my wife," Patton replied. "How did you get it?" "It was intercepted by military censors," Eisenhower said, "which is standard procedure for all mail from senior officers." "George, did you really think you could write 9 pages advocating war with the Soviet Union and it wouldn't be flagged?" Old Blood and Guts felt anger rising. "You're reading my private correspondence? Letters to my wife?" "Yes," Eisenhower snapped, "because your private correspondence advocates policies that could start World War III. Because you're a senior general and everything you write is potentially classified. Because you don't have the luxury of privacy when you're commanding armies." Eisenhower stood up, began pacing. "George, do you understand what you've done? You've put in writing a plan to attack our ally, to rearm the Germans, to launch a surprise offensive against the Soviet Union. If this letter had been intercepted by Soviet intelligence, if Stalin had gotten his hands on this, the Red Army would be mobilizing right now. They'd be preparing for American attack. They'd be launching preemptive operations. You would have started World War III with a letter to your wife." "Everything in that letter is true," Patton said stubbornly. "Stalin is our enemy. We should be preparing to fight him, not cooperating with him. We're handing Eastern Europe to a dictator who's worse than Hitler. And you're telling me I can't even write to my wife about it?" "You can write whatever you want to. Your wife when you're a private citizen," Eisenhower replied. "But you're not a private citizen. You're a 3-star general commanding the largest American army in Europe. Your words matter. Your ideas have consequences. And this," Eisenhower waved the letter, "this is political insanity. Rearming the Germans, attacking the Soviets? The American people would never support it. Congress would never authorize it. The British would abandon the alliance. The entire world would see us as warmongers, as betrayers, as no better than the Nazis who started this whole war with surprise attacks on their neighbors. Maybe that's because the entire world doesn't understand what's really at stake," Patton argued. "Maybe everyone's so relieved the fighting is over that they can't see the next threat. Maybe political considerations are blinding everyone to strategic reality." "Strategic reality?" Eisenhower's voice rose. "George, the strategic reality is that America is exhausted. Our soldiers want to go home. Our people want peace. Our economy needs to convert from wartime to peacetime production. We don't have the political will or the public support for another war, especially not a war against the nation that helped us defeat Germany, especially not a war that you're advocating we start with surprise attack using rearmed German soldiers. It's politically impossible, militarily questionable, and morally reprehensible. So maybe it's politically impossible right now," Patton said. "What about in 5 years, in 10 years, when Stalin has consolidated control of Eastern Europe, when the Soviet Union has rebuilt its military, when they're strong enough to threaten all of Europe? What do we do then, Ike? Fight a war we could have won easily today but will cost millions of lives tomorrow? We deal with that when it comes," Eisenhower replied. "If it comes, maybe Stalin will be reasonable. Maybe the Soviets will withdraw peacefully. Maybe we can build a lasting peace through cooperation and diplomacy." "You're naive," Patton said bluntly. "Stalin isn't interested in peace. He's interested in power, in expanding Soviet influence, in spreading communism. And we're helping him do it. We're giving him half of Europe. We're disarming the one force that could stop him. We're making the same mistake Chamberlain made with Hitler. We're appeasing a dictator and calling it diplomacy. And when war comes, and it will come, everyone will say we should have acted sooner, should have been more aggressive, should have listened to the warnings. Just like they said about Hitler in 1939. The argument continued for an hour, Eisenhower trying to make Patton understand political realities, Patton trying to make Eisenhower see strategic threats. Neither man convincing the other. Finally, Eisenhower made his decision. George, I'm confiscating this letter. It will be destroyed. It will never reach Beatrice, and you are never, ever to write anything like this again. No more letters about attacking Soviets. No more plans for rearming Germans. No more advocating policies that contradict official Allied strategy. Is that clear? You're censoring my private correspondence? Patton demanded. I'm preventing you from starting World War III with your private correspondence, Eisenhower replied. George, I'm trying to protect you from yourself, from your worst instincts. You're a brilliant combat commander, but you're a political disaster. You say things that create international incidents. You advocate policies that are politically impossible. And if you don't learn to control yourself, you're going to destroy your career and damage everything we've built. My career? Patton laughed bitterly. Ike, my career is already over. The war is done. Combat commanders aren't needed anymore. Political generals are. Administrators are. Diplomats are. People like you who can smile and shake hands and pretend that enemies are friends. I'm old blood and guts. I'm good at killing people and breaking things. That's not a valued skill in peacetime. So, my career is finished whether I write letters or not. Then think about your legacy, Eisenhower said quietly. Think about how history will remember you. Do you want to be remembered as one of the greatest combat commanders in American history? Or as the general who couldn't stop fighting? Who wanted to start another war before the last one was even cold? Who advocated allying with Nazis against our wartime allies? That's your choice, George. Control yourself now, or be remembered as a warmonger and a fool. George Smith Patton stood silently. He knew Eisenhower was right about the politics, knew his letter was career suicide, knew advocating war with the Soviet Union would destroy whatever reputation he had left. But he also knew he was right about Stalin, about the threat, about what was coming. I'm right about the Soviets, Patton said finally. You know I'm right. You're just too political to admit it. Maybe, Eisenhower replied. Maybe you're right about Stalin. Maybe war is coming. Maybe we'll regret not acting now. But George, even if you're right strategically, you're wrong politically. And politics matters. In war and in peace, politics matters. You've never understood that. You've never wanted to understand it. And that's why your career is ending while mine is just beginning. The meeting concluded. The letter was destroyed, burned in a fireplace at Supreme Headquarters, along with the only copies. George Smith Patton left Reims knowing his relationship with Eisenhower had fundamentally changed. They'd been friends for decades, had served together, had fought together. But now, there was a barrier between them. Eisenhower saw Patton as politically dangerous, a liability who needed to be controlled, and Patton saw Eisenhower as politically corrupted. A general who'd lost the courage to speak truth because it might damage his career. The friendship was over, not officially, not publicly, but privately, in ways that mattered. The bond between old blood and guts and Ike had been severed. George Smith Patton never wrote another letter like that. Never again put his true thoughts about the Soviet Union on paper. He'd learned his lesson, learned that privacy didn't exist for senior generals, learned that speaking truth could destroy careers, learned that, in the post-war world, political correctness mattered more than strategic insight. But he never stopped believing he was right, never stopped warning anyone who would listen about the Soviet threat, never stopped advocating aggressive policies towards Stalin. And when he was killed in that car accident in December of 1945, as many people wondered if it was really an accident, wondered if a general who knew too much, who said too much, who threatened too many political arrangements, had been silenced. The truth about that accident remains classified. The files remain sealed. The questions remain unanswered. But the letter exists, not the original, that was destroyed. But decades later, after both Eisenhower and Patton were dead, a staff officer who'd been present at Supreme Headquarters in 1945 wrote a memoir. And in that memoir, he described the letter, quoted passages from memory, reconstructed what George Smith Patton had written to his wife, and historians realized that old blood and guts had been right. Prescient. The Cold War did come. World War III did almost start, multiple times. The Soviet Union did consolidate control of Eastern Europe, and Stalin did prove to be as dangerous as Patton warned. Everything old blood and guts predicted in that letter came true. The Korean War, the Berlin crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, decades of Cold War conflict that cost millions of lives and trillions of dollars. All of it predicted by George Smith Patton in May 1945. All of it dismissed as the ravings of a warmonger who couldn't adjust to peace. If Patton's plan had been implemented, if America had acted in May 1945, would it have worked? Would a combined American-German force have driven the Soviets out of Eastern Europe? Would it have prevented the Cold War? We'll never know. The political will didn't exist. The public support wasn't there. The moral framework couldn't accommodate allying with defeated Nazis against victorious allies. So, the opportunity passed. The Soviets consolidated their position. The Iron Curtain descended, and the world lived with Cold War for 45 years, all because one general's letter was intercepted, was destroyed, was prevented from reaching his wife, was censored to protect political arrangements that George Smith Patton believed were strategic catastrophes. This is the story they don't teach in history classes, the story of the letter that could have started World War III, the letter that predicted the Cold War, the letter that Eisenhower intercepted and destroyed to protect the fragile peace. Was Eisenhower right to censor it? To prevent Patton from speaking his mind? To prioritize politics over strategic debate? Or was Patton right that America missed its opportunity in 1945? That acting decisively against Stalin would have prevented decades of conflict? History doesn't provide clear answers, only consequences. And the consequences were 45 years of Cold War, nuclear standoff, proxy conflicts from Korea to Afghanistan, millions dead, billions spent on arms races, the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, all because in May 1945, America chose political stability over aggressive action, chose coalition unity over strategic opportunity, chose to trust Stalin instead of confronting him. George Smith Patton saw it all coming, wrote it in a letter to his wife, and Dwight Eisenhower burned that letter to protect the peace, to prevent World War III from starting before World War II was even cold, to maintain the alliance that had won the war, to preserve political arrangements that he believed were necessary for lasting peace. Both men were acting according to their principles. Both believed they were right. Both were trying to serve America's interests. They just had fundamentally different visions of what those interests were. Eisenhower believed in coalition building, in diplomatic engagement, in patient containment of Soviet ambitions, in building international institutions like the United Nations that could prevent future wars. His vision shaped American foreign policy for decades, created the framework for eventual victory in the Cold War without nuclear holocaust. Patton believed in aggressive action, in striking first, in eliminating threats before they could fully develop, in military strength as the foundation of peace, in never giving enemies time to consolidate power. His vision was dismissed as warmongering, as politically naive, as dangerous. But decades later, when the costs of the Cold War were tallied, some historians wondered if old blood and guts had been right after all. If acting decisively in 1945 would have been less costly than decades of containment. If one preventive war might have saved multiple proxy wars. If confronting Stalin immediately would have been more humane than allowing Soviet dictatorship to oppress Eastern Europe for 2 generations. We'll never know the answer, because the letter was intercepted, because Eisenhower made his choice, because political considerations outweighed strategic ones, because in May 1945, America chose peace over war, chose trust over suspicion, chose cooperation over confrontation, and lived with the consequences for half a century. This is the untold story of World War II, the story of what didn't happen, the war that wasn't fought, the decision that wasn't made, the letter that was destroyed, and the general who saw the future and couldn't convince anyone to listen. George Smith Patton's letter to his wife was 9 pages long, handwritten, personal, honest, and it predicted everything that came next. The Cold War, the arms race, the proxy conflicts, the nuclear standoff, all of it laid out in May 1945 by a general everyone dismissed as politically naive. If this story of the letter that could have changed history has moved you, hit subscribe. We're bringing you the stories they don't teach, the moments that were buried, the truths that were censored, the decisions that shaped our world in ways we're only beginning to understand. This is real history, unfiltered, uncomfortable, true. The letter is gone, destroyed in 1945, but the questions it raised remain. Unique questions about when to fight and when to negotiate, about trusting enemies and confronting allies, about political wisdom and strategic courage, about the price of peace and the cost of war. George Smith Patton and Dwight Eisenhower gave different answers to those questions. Both were brilliant generals. Both served America faithfully. Both deserve to be remembered as heroes. But they had fundamentally different visions of how America should navigate the post-war world. Eisenhower's vision prevailed. America chose diplomacy over aggression, containment over confrontation, patient Cold War over immediate hot war, and history remembers Eisenhower as a statesman and Patton as a warrior who couldn't adjust to peace. But maybe, just maybe, Old Blood and Guts understood something that everyone else missed. Maybe he saw the Soviet threat with clarity that political generals couldn't match. Maybe his letter to Beatrice contained truths that were too dangerous to acknowledge. Maybe the world would have been better off if someone had listened to General George Smith Patton in May 1945. We'll never know, because the letter was intercepted and the opportunity was lost. And World War III didn't start in 1945. It just smoldered for 45 years instead. This has been the story of what Eisenhower discovered in Patton's letter. 9 pages that could have started World War III. 9 pages that predicted the Cold War. 9 pages that were destroyed to protect the peace. Remember his warning. Remember his vision. And remember that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is tell the truth too soon, before the world is ready to hear it. George Smith Patton learned that lesson, paid for it with his career, with his reputation, with his life, but history proved him right, just too late to matter.